Well, Oscar, thank you so much for kicking us off so beautifully. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first IABC Queensland event of 2021. My name is Brooke Donovan. I'm the immediate past president of IABC Queensland, and I'm filling in tonight for our president, Alicia Sutherland, who unfortunately is not well. Sounds like there's something going around. So I'm very happy to step in on her behalf. I'm very excited about tonight's event with Oscar. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all our IABC members who've joined us. And for those who aren't IABC members yet, I would like to briefly introduce who we are as the International Association of Business Communicators. IABC is a vibrant global association representing communications professionals, and we're all about creating connections. And tonight very much fits the bill in terms of those connections and how we can strengthen them. Communications professionals have earned their seat at the table now and are more influential than ever, having been recognised for the critical role that we play in organisational success through strategic advice, tactical performance, and those in-demand skill sets. So IABC has more than 10,000 professional members across the world, and we support our community with innovative thinking, shared best practice, in-depth learning, and career guidance. And now for tonight's speaker, the reason that we're here, Oscar Trimboli is on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. He's an author, host of the Apple Award-winning podcast Deep Listening, and a sought-after keynote speaker. So we're very lucky to have him. He's passionate about using the gift of listening to bring positive change in homes, workplaces, and around the world. Through his work with chairs, boards of directors, and executive teams in local, regional, and global organisations, Oscar has experienced firsthand the transformational impact that leaders and organisations can have when they listen beyond the words. He consults to organisations including American Express, AstraZeneca, Cisco, Google, HSBC, News Corp, Qantas, and TripAdvisor, helping executives and their teams listen to what's unsaid by their customers and employees. We're delighted that Oscar could join us. We've already, in the last little while, been having some really interesting chats. Very excited to get moving and listen to Oscar and to each other. So with that, I will hand over to Oscar. Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke, for that gracious introduction. And I would invite everybody with a really practical kind of tip to start off with. And the practical tip is in the top corner of your screen is to switch your view into speaker view. Switch your view into speaker view. And by switching your view into speaker view, that will help remove distractions so you can listen to what's being said. I wish it was my ego saying this, but if you switch the top right view from gallery view to speaker view, you can remove distractions. Our listening database of over 6,500 listeners in the workplace tell us that the biggest barrier to their listening is distractions, whether that's a cell phone, a mobile phone, an iPad, a computer, whatever the case may be. These are the things that get in the way of our listening. So tip number one is move the view straight into speaker view. And this is what you want your teams to do as well when you're hosting in the workplace also. The next tip I would suggest is drag the view of the speaker as close as possible to your webcam. And that will mean your eyes are as focused on the speaker as they can be in a virtual world. There is a great deal of cognitive dissonance we deal with when we're looking over here, but knowing that we should be looking over there. Help yourself out. Just bring my view, the speaker view, as close as possible to your webcam as you can. And that will reduce some Zoom fatigue. Well documented. I had the opportunity to interview Professor Cheryl Barman on this very topic about cognitive dissonance and fatigue because we're not looking straight ahead as if we were looking into somebody's eyes. Now, don't get me wrong, it's completely unnatural to stare into a webcam for an hour and think you're looking into somebody's eyes, but will help your concentration. For extra points today, I'm going to ask you all at some point for these huge global prizes, what color eyes do I have? And noticing the speaker's eyes will be a reset for you. When you drift away, which will happen every 12 seconds, you can only listen continuously for 12 seconds and then your attention jumps. Notice what color my eyes are. So with that very simple video conferencing technique out of the way, bring that to your teams, bring that to the video conferences that you participate in, and it's going to reduce a lot of your fatigue as well. I just want to acknowledge the Wadamadagal people, the lands on which I stand while I'm doing this presentation. They've taught me much about listening, and particularly they've taught me about this very simple word called Dardiri. Dardiri means listen to yourself, your people, and your lands. And the lands on which I'm lucky enough to stand on because they've looked after them for millennia. That beautiful word Dardiri, it means listen first to yourself, next to your people, and then finally to your lands, is a way they've sustained their culture over 60,000 years of continuous inhabitants. And Auntie Rose from the Dali River, part of the Northern Territory, has just won the Australian Senior of the Year National Australia Day Award. And she does a lot of work trying to bridge the gap between the way Aboriginals listen and helping us white fellas figuring out how to listen in their ways as well. I think there's a simple bridge we can gap between the two of us when it comes to our listening. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me. It's a gift that you give your attention, but sometimes we think we have to pay attention. And paying attention is something that feels like a tax. It's something we have to do rather than something we want to do. So just in the chat box right now, I'm curious, are you giving attention or are you paying attention? Which one are you doing? Pop it in the chat box. Are you giving attention or are you paying attention? Which one are you doing right now? Now, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to giving or paying attention. What's important is that you notice which one you're doing. Are you giving attention or are you paying attention? That's the critical thing we want to focus on. Also notice, are you in comparison at the moment? Oh, a lot of people saying paying, but I'm giving, or a lot of people saying both. The critical thing when it comes to listening is situational, it's relational, and it's contextual. So you'll listen differently to a police officer than you will to a school principal. You'll listen differently to an actor than you will to an accountant. And the thing we want to do is just cut ourselves a little bit of slack, because I don't know about you, but when I went to school, I didn't have a listening teacher. When I went to university, I didn't have a listening class. Most of us learn how to speak effectively, eloquently, with influence. Yet none of us have really learned how to listen. And that's the quest for 100 million deep listeners in the world. So when it comes to listening, sometimes it's who we don't listen to that has the biggest systemic impact. I'd like to introduce you to a basketball-loving ophthalmologist, Dr. Weiling Li from Wuhan Hospital. You see, on the 30th of December 2019, he set a message on WeChat saying, I've noticed that there are SARS-like symptoms in a group of pensioners inside our hospital, and it's been devastating on them. Look after your parents, look after your grandparents. Now, before we judge the Chinese authorities too quickly, what we want to know is, Who aren't you listening to in your organizations? Who aren't you listening to in your stakeholders? Who aren't you listening to in your systems? See, when he sent this message to 6 of his basketball buddies, the Chinese authorities found out about it and 4 days later told him that he was wrong, it was not true, and he needed to retract the messages he left on WeChat. He spent 4 days thinking about it, and on the 8th day afterwards, he went to the authorities, says, I won't be able to retract it. And the very next day, while looking after patients in hospital, Dr. Weiling Li contracted COVID himself. 28 days later, he passed away. In the 8 days that were lost when the Chinese authorities weren't listening to Dr. Weiling Li, the virus that is COVID-19 as we know it now spread to Milan, it spread to Seattle, and as a result, it spread all around the world. Now, before we judge the Chinese authorities too harshly, ask yourself this question. Who aren't we listening to in our system? Is it somebody on the front line? Is it somebody in the contact center? Is it a group of stakeholders that hold differing opinions to us? Because it's in difference as well as similarities that we can make progress as systems. August 2005, Dr. Rajan Ragan, a lover of Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, an electrical engineer and a vegetarian who loves nothing more than to read fiction. But he's also the head economist of the World Bank, and he's telling a bunch of central bankers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the global financial system plumbing is backed up, and when it explodes, the smell will last a very long time. We know what happens next. But what happened immediately was the central bank has castigated him and laughed at him. The good news is Dr. Rajan published his paper on the 18th of August 2005 and explained the root cause of the global financial crisis 2 years before it happened. Who aren't you listening to in your organization and your system? Are you not listening to people from differing professions, people who have differing perspectives, people who have a different way of looking at the same challenges? April 2012, 40 kilometers off the Louisiana coast, we see the Deepwater Horizon's oil rig. And for months, the engineers had been resetting and refitting the oil rig because they had some routine maintenance. But the management wanted production to come out faster, and they told the engineers to speed it up. The engineers raised a red flag and said, we can't, there'll be some consequences. Now, the consequences we know are vast. When the Deepwater Horizon's oil rig blew up, it took the best part of 6 months to fix. It's still costing BP today. It is now at $52 billion in payments that BP is making in reparations for all the coastal communities that were impacted by this lack of listening. And although $52 billion sounds like a lot of money, this number, 11, is the most important number. 11 lives were lost on the Deepwater Horizons because management weren't listening to production line workers saying the rig wasn't safe to continue. Who loves Lego? Who thinks everything is awesome when you're part of a team? Well, the very first thing you want to know about Lego is that Lego comes from the Danish legot, which means play well together. And Lego was originally wooden, not plastic. And the reason Lego discovered that they should be making plastic pieces is because their factory burnt down. And Lego from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s was a global powerhouse. That game went all around the world. Interesting fact, the largest market in the 20th century for Lego was Japan, not the United States. Lego developed theme parks like Disneyland for Lego lovers. But there's a movie called The Adventures of Crush Craddock, the very first Lego movie ever made. And it was a complete disaster. And unless you're a complete Lego nerd, you've never even heard of this movie. The movie was designed by the executives at Lego, and they spent the best part of $60 million on making this movie, and it returned $2 million at the box office. It was a complete disaster. They weren't listening to their fans. As a result, the CEO ate some humble pie and went to some directors, Lord and Miller in the United States, and said, can you make the next Lego movie? And what they did, there's a group of people called adult fans of Lego. And the adult fans of Lego have meetings every Saturday, every Sunday in their communities. And Lord and Miller spent 3 months listening to the fans. They learned something really interesting. And Jennifer will know this because she's a big Lego fan. Don't use glue when it comes to Lego. They even have a word for it. It's called a kegel. And using glue when it comes to Lego is just not the done thing. But because Lord and Miller heard this, they made their villain the kegel. They made the villain glue. And as a result, it was the adult fans of Lego who spread the word about the movie. That went on to creating a $1 billion movie franchise and another $1 billion computer games software franchise for Lego as well. How well are you listening to your deep fans, the ones that really care about what you do, the ones that really passionately speak about what your organization does? Because too many of us sometimes, well, maybe we ignore what the fans are saying because they're fans. But sometimes the real truth, the real origin story of what you're trying to communicate is there in your fans. So in the chat box, I'd love you to just put in there, in your organizational system, please don't name names, reference these as titles or groups. Who aren't you listening to in your system that you thought while Oscar was talking about these 4 important listening stories, gee, I've got to start listening to these people. It might be employees. You've done an employee engagement survey, but you haven't actually actioned it. So you might put employees for that. You might put the contact center team. You might put politicians. You might put voters. Pop in the chat window, in your organization, who aren't you listening to? Now, Jenny, when you use the word users, I know there are only 2 industries that use that name, the drug industry. You're a user when you're a drug user, and a software company. So user is an interesting term. Grassroots staff, thank you, Mary. Customer relationship managers. Thanks, Jenny, for the clarification. Jennifer says volunteers are important to us. We may or may not be listening to them. Jennifer, are you okay to come off mute and talk about at what point during my conversation it prompted you to go volunteers?
Sure. I work in internal communications, so I work with our internal stakeholders, and they're divided between staff and volunteers, or paid members and volunteer members, and they can often be 2 completely opposing views. The volunteers don't always like the paid staff don't always like the volunteers, but by head count, volunteers far outweigh the paid staff. They are also spread a lot further in the community than our paid staff. So they're the ones who are hearing what members of the community have to say. They're the ones who are on the ground working more with the community than our paid staff. Paid staff have a very important job to do. They go in, they get the job, and they get out. It's the volunteer members who live in the communities, who run community groups, who help people when they're in need. So they have the time and the passion to stay and listen, where paid staff often have to get in and get out.
Yeah, I think when you think about IABC, whether I've done this presentation here or in London or in the US, the vast volume of communication you create is all about systemic broadcast of message. There's now only starting to emerge a group of people out of the UK who are writing about this other half of listening, the missing half of listening, which is listening to all the wider systemic people. And I think as an industry, we need to get to a place where we go, we are as comfortable with the systems we use to broadcast messages as we are as comfortable with the systems we use to collect what we should be listening to when it comes to our stakeholders. I think we've all got work to do there. I think today is one example of starting on that journey as well. And the Quill Awards are now starting to reward people who are doing a great job of starting off with listening carefully to their stakeholders. Thanks, Jennifer. I appreciate that. Now, I want to put you on notice. Here's a dirty little secret of listening when it comes to conversations. Don't start by focusing on the speaker. I know it's crazy. You got the listening guy saying, don't focus on the speaker. Listening starts first by focusing on you and listening to yourself. Because most of us have many browser tabs opened up in our own mind when it comes to listening. It's happening for you right now. Some of you have gone, I wish I would have got some dinner before this presentation started. Some of you have gone, I wish I would have got a different dinner. Some of you are going, oh, what have I got to do before I finish up tonight? You can only listen continuously for 12 seconds. That's what the neuroscience teaches us. So starting by listening to yourself starts much earlier than you think. Starting by listening to yourself happened when you were inside your mother's womb. At 32 weeks, you can distinguish the sound of your mother from any other sound in the outside world. You can distinguish Beethoven from Bon Jovi, from Justin Bieber at the age of 34 weeks. Listening is our birthright, but the minute we're born, we come kicking and screaming into the world, and we think the only way we can communicate is by speaking. This exercise I'm about to give you has been done around the world since February last year. I've done it in 196 different online environments to over 25,000 people. And whatever I say, this turns out to be the most powerful part of the presentation, not because I'm saying it, this is what they say when we debrief. For the next 3 minutes, please don't be tempted to do your email, but I just want you to be by yourself and your own thoughts. Ideally, if you can do this and just close your eyes, even better. If you've got a glass of water handy, please drink a glass of water. But I want you to just pause for 3 minutes and ask yourself this very simple question. What am I not listening to? In myself, in my health, in my nutrition, in my sleep, in my peers, in my managers, in my systems, in my organizations. You might even go, what am I not listening to in my future? So for the next 3 minutes, I'm going to do the exercise as well. And what I'd like you to do, just be by yourself. Ideally, just close your eyes and just think about all the things that you need to be listening to when it comes to you. We'll see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back. We do this exercise and we tend to have a range of words that people use to describe the impact of this. So please just use one word in the chat. Trevor, you're going to have to collect a couple of words from the group and pop them in the chat box. And again, it's an exercise you can do with your teams. Very few of us take the time to pause and just simply get the team to listen to themselves. So please consider doing this exercise for your team. While that's happening, have a look in the chat box and see what everybody else is saying. We've got words like powerful, grounding, stimulating, confronting, grounding, refreshing, meditative, unnerving, reflective. Trevor, we're going to have to get a couple of words from you there, but thank you. One of the things I want you to be conscious of, everything that was playing in your mind while you were listening to yourself is what's going on in your subconscious when you're listening to other people. And I want to give you a couple of techniques that makes it really simple to listen to yourself first so you can be available, so you can shut down all the browser tabs. Tip number one, switch off the notifications on your laptop, on your computer, on your iPad, on your phone. Use the technology, don't let the technology use you. So switch off those notifications. If you're on a Mac or a PC, it's one button. If you really want to be clever, there's a function on the Mac and the PC that will automatically switch off your notifications when your calendar is in a meeting. So you won't receive any notifications. You'll never have to think about it again. Use the technology, don't let the technology use you. Tip number two is really simple. Drink a glass of water every half an hour. A hydrated brain is a listening brain. It also sends a signal to the parasympathetic nervous system that says everything's okay and you can be present for the conversation. Everything's going to be okay. You can listen. Tip number one, switch the notifications off. Tip number two, drink water. And then tip number three, take a deep breath, or ideally 3 deep breaths. 3 deep breaths before the conversation starts. And when you notice you're distracted, take a deep breath. Again, it's sending a signal to the body that says everything is okay. Hey, for round one, let's have a go. What color eyes has Oscar got? Do you want to pop it in the chat box? Whoever gets it first will get a huge prize. Well worth it. What color eyes has Oscar got? And helps you to think about your distractions. Okay, so we're going to talk about 5 levels of listening today. And the first level of listening foundationally is level 1. Now, please make sure you're in speaker view. That'll make it easier for you to stay away from distractions. Level 2 is where most literature is written about listening. It's called active listening. It's about listening to the content. It's about paraphrasing. It's about non-verbal affirmatives such as tell me more. All these kinds of things will keep you at the content. The thing about content is most people think it's about words, about sentences, and about stories. Yes, it is that, but it's so much more. It's also what you see. It's also what you sense. It's people's body language. And people say to me, oh, Oscar, it's so much harder to read body language now that we're in a video world. And I say to them, don't always watch to listen, because you can hear more if you just use part of the video conference to go into listen only mode. Don't be distracted by the visual distractions, and you'll hear deeper things in their voice. You'll hear whether their voice is coming from here or whether their voice is coming from here, sending a really interesting signal. People can actually listen to the nuance in people's voices better with their eyes closed. Who would have thought? Now, in a face-to-face interaction, you're not going to get away with your eyes closed. But the great thing about video is you can close your eyes and nobody has any idea. It also gives you a bit of a rest. So why don't you just practice listening to me for the next 5 minutes with your eyes closed, see what you notice differently. Listening to the content is about words, sentences, and stories, but it's also about what you see and what you sense. It's what energy is the voice giving you, not just what they're saying. The same is true, for example, employee engagement, data that you collect. Too many of us rely on verbatim, and we don't operate well at the next level of listening. Here's a really simple thing that the Chinese have taught us. Way back in the 12th century, in fact, we had this character called Ting. It's a 6-dimensional character, and it was taught to the emperors in waiting. Ting talks about hearing, seeing, focusing, being present, and listening for their feelings. Ting is a very powerful way to think about listening. In Mandarin, Ting is a very active phrase. It means to listen. It's not a passive phrase. It's not like we're doing therapy and we're just listening in the background. Let me give you a commercial break from neuroscience. And I want to introduce you to the first concept that's really critical to understand what distracts you when it comes to your listening and what distracts your team when it comes to your listening. It's the 125-400 rule. The 125-400 rule says I speak at 125 words a minute, yet you can listen 4 times faster. So you're completely distracted. In fact, you can only listen continuously for 12 seconds. And then your mind starts to jump around and the monkey mind starts to think about dinner, breakfast. What have I got to do tomorrow? Oh, have I fed the dog? Oh, do I have a dog? Why is the dog barking? Gee, this guy talks slow. I wish he'd speed up and get to the point. All these things are going through your mind right now. So if you know you're programmed to be distracted, there is a difference between my speaking speed and your listening speed. We know that blind people can listen at up to 300 words per minute with complete comprehension. We know cattle yard auctioneers can speak at 200 words per minute. Horse race callers can speak at 200 words per minute, and we can still have complete comprehension. Let's look at level 3 now. Let's look at listening for context. This is listening for the backstory. It's the origin of the problem. Too many of us turn up to an issue, a project, a program, an initiative, as if we turn up to a movie 20 minutes in and we don't know where the story started. We don't know who the actors are in the background. We don't know how the actors are all connected to each other. A really powerful phrase. Can you just take me back to when this all started? And a whole Pandora's box of relationships and issues and nuance open up. High context cultures such as Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Indonesians do this extraordinarily well. In low context cultures like German, English, United States, we're very transactional and we don't go to the backstory enough. So when it comes to listening for the context, we're doing 2 things: knowing where the story started from, but we're also listening for patterns. Patterns about, are they talking about the future or the past? Are they talking sequentially or randomly? Are they talking in facts or are they talking in frameworks? Are they talking in stories or are they talking in statistics? All of these are coded ways for us to understand what happens when it comes to listening for context. For those of you who've got your eyes closed, now would be a great time for you to come back and just practice listening with your eyes and your ears. I'm curious, for those of you who closed your eyes, pop in the chat. What did you notice was different about your listening when you were listening with your eyes closed? When you were listening with your eyes closed, pop in the chat what was going on for you. Oh, I see some people have had a go at my eye color. Let me see who the winner chicken dinner would be. Okay, Erin Myers, congratulations. You will be the winner of the Deep Listening book and playing cards. I'll speak to you later on about how to get your postal address and send it to you. By the way, depending on the time of day, my eye color is green. So for those of you who put green, that's okay. It's got to do apparently with how hydrated my eyes are. Who would have known that? But hazel is the answer. Or as my granddaughter Ruby, who's 7 years old, says, Nutella, Oscar, Nutella eyes. Not chocolate, but made out of hazelnuts. So I always say, thank you, Ruby. Well done, Erin. pop in there, just for those of you who had your eyes closed, what happened to you while you were listening with your eyes closed? Now, notice some people said it was harder. Jenny, thank you. And I was worried that I was missing something visual, says Brooke. Trevor said it was sharper for him. Erin's very excited to win a fabulous prize. Bianca was focused more. Bianca, are you okay to come off and have a quick chat about how you were focused more? If you're not, it's okay.
Yes, no problem. Sorry, just can't get my video to work tonight.
No problems.
But just felt that
it's not required for the exact topic we're talking about. We can listen to you.
No worries. So just found I was really focused on each word that you were saying with when my eyes were closed. And
Do you think that's something you'll be able to practice when it comes to video conferencing listening?
Possibly, yeah. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Trevor, was the sharper answer yours personally or from someone else in the group?
Someone else in the group.
Would they like to be brave and talk us through that?
It was just a clearer audio, so it sounded different from when you saw you talking.
Yeah.
I could actually pick out the words much more clearly, and it actually felt louder when my eyes were shut.
And was it easier or harder to listen?
I think it's easier, probably because there's no distractions, because you're simply using your ears.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry I don't know your name, but thank you. I would just say, if you're hosting video conferencing, use this technique and invite participants at some point to spend 5 minutes with their eyes closed and listen. They will listen differently. Now, I was curious, Jenny Kidd, if you're okay, had to listen harder. What did that feel like for you? Are you okay to come off?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And yes, I do have bloodshot eyes today as well.
Yeah, well, thought I'd throw that in. Really, it was about, I found that I physically turned, even though I've got the cans on, I had to turn and listen because I was concentrating. Yeah. So it was really about concentrating. So I meant listening harder. I had to really sort of, felt like every other thing's blocked off. So you have to concentrate harder.
By the way, when you turn to listen with the ear in that way, you're actually listening more for emotion. So I was curious if you did the listening quiz.
I had done it a while ago though, okay. And I can't exactly remember.
Were you the dramatic listener by any chance?
Possibly. Yeah, no, I was. You're right.
Yeah, so dramatic listeners listen for emotion. That's how they create connection. When done productively, that's great. When done unproductively, it becomes a really emotional conversation. Thanks for creating that nuance. By the way, that I learned about the ear turn from a couple of foreign language interpreters and deaf interpreters. Even though they're signing, deaf interpreters will turn their ear despite the fact that not much is being said by the deaf person. They're signing. But when it comes to listening to the speaking person, they will turn their ear to dial up their listening when it comes to that as well. And on our podcast, we've interviewed a number of foreign language interpreters, high court judges, hostage negotiators, who are all giving us great tips when it comes to listening. Bring it home now. We want to talk about level 4, level 4 is listening for what's unsaid. At level 4, we are tuning in on a completely different frequency. If Yoda from Star Wars was here, he would say, unsaid, listen for. Doesn't make sense, but nor does it make any sense to listen for what's unsaid. And when we were listening to Dr. Wei-Ling Lee, to Dr. Rajan Raghu, when we were listening to the Deepwater Horizons or the Lego players, the basic rule and the neuroscience of speaking is I speak at 125 words a minute, but I can think at nearly 1,000 words per minute. So the very first thing I say, there's only an 11% chance that what I say is what I mean. There's only 11% chance that what I say is what I mean. And here's the dirty little secret of listening. It's not your job to make sense of what they're saying. It's not your job to make sense of what they're saying. It's your job to help them understand what they're thinking. And if you can move your orientation from listening to meaning for you to listening for meaning for them, you'll be a very, very powerful listener. When it comes to listening, here are 3 phrases you can practice when it comes to listening for what's unsaid. Phrase number 1, tell me more. By the way, if you ever use a question that's got more than 7 words in it, it's linguistically biased. So if you have an employee engagement or a survey that you're sending out and it's got more than 7 words in it, the likelihood that person can comprehend it in a way that's neutral is low. So be careful when it comes to asking questions. 7 words or less is better. But even fewer is even better. And we'll see with tip number 2. Tip number 2, and what else? Now, when you use these 2 phrases, what people will do is they'll go, actually, now that I think about it, can we talk about this? Or, now that I think about it, what's more important than this is that. Give me a +1 if you've ever taken enough time to ask people, tell me more or what else. And they literally will sigh. They'll change their body position and they'll tell you, oh, actually. And they will use that precise phrase. They'll use the word actually, and they'll change their mind or they'll change their perspective. Give us a +1 if that's ever happened to you. Now, tip number 3, listen very carefully for the words in tip number 3. Here it comes. Listen carefully. Now, don't worry, the video hadn't frozen. Tip number 3 is the use of pause. It's no coincidence that the words silent and listen have exactly the same letters in them. If you pause long enough, particularly if you're the interrupting listening villain, you will discover that people have more things to say rather than you being the quiz show contestant who presses the buzzer and answers the wrong question. So those 3 tips. Tell me more, and what else, and use of silence. Again, in the West, we use these phrases called the pregnant pause, the awkward silence, the deafening silence. Yet in high context cultures and in the East, we see silence as a sign of wisdom, of authority, of executive presence. Our final level of listening is level 5, listening for the meaning. And my very favorite story about listening for meaning is Chris is 4 years old, comes home from kindergarten and says to his mum, today was the most exciting day. We learned maths and I learned that 3 is half of 8. Now, Jenny, she just rolled her eyes like, what are they teaching these kids at school today? 3 is not half of 8. Anyway, Chris is running around the house singing 3 is half of 8, 3 is half of 8, and she's getting really frustrated. So Jenny goes up to the cupboard, grabs 8 M&Ms and lays them out on the table and says, Christopher, honey, come over here. And she laid out the 8 M&Ms like little soldiers, 4 on this side, 4 on that side, all waiting for a military parade. And she said, Chris, look over here. There's 4 and 4, and that's 8. 4 is half of 8. He goes, Mummy, 3 is half of 8. And he ran over to the same cupboard, grabbed a piece of paper, drew the figure 8, folded the piece of paper in half, tore it down the middle and went, see, Mum, 3 is half of 8. And in that moment, Jennifer learned that 3 is half of 8 as well as 4. It's just about what the meaning is behind it. For many of you, you were quite frustrated with the story about 3 being half of 8. And yet in the moment where I folded the paper in half and tore it, you went, 3 could also be half of 8. How many Christophers are you not listening to in your organization, in your systems, because you think that 4 is half of 8? I'm Oscar Trimboli. I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world, and you've given me the greatest gift of all today. You've listened to me. I'm looking forward to listening to your questions. Brooke, back to you.
I will unmute. Thank you so much, Oscar. That was just absolutely full of aha moments. I have been scribbling notes the whole time, which I very much hope did not impact my listening.
Well, let's chat about note-taking.
Sure, great.
Because I think it's a question I get quite often. While we're waiting, by the way, just pop into the chat. One thing you learned today that you'll apply immediately. Pop in the chat. One thing you learned today that you'll apply immediately. Now, Brooke, when note-taking is a really interesting thing. Take notes that are graphical rather than verbatim. When you take verbatim notes, what's happening in the brain is you're talking to yourself and you're shutting down the neural pathway that enables listening. If you do need to take verbatim notes, just say to your counterpart, look, what you said is really important. Can you just pause? Because I want to make a note of that. Whether it's high court judges, graphical facilitators, or world memory experts, did you know there's a World Memory Olympics? I didn't know there was such a thing, but they all take graphical notes. The visual part of the brain increases recall, but accentuates the meaning and the actions in the conversation. So taking notes is great, especially if you're going to apply it back to somebody, but try and dial down the verbatim notes you take and dial up the graphical notes you take. You don't have to be a graphical scribe. Now, that was a beautiful example of the interrupting listening villain in action. So I'll let Brooke continue.
Thank you very much. No, that's brilliant. And for those who haven't done it yet, Oscar's listening quiz is incredibly insightful. I learned that my listening villains are the lost listener, which means that I daydream, and the shrewd listener, which sounds like a good thing, but actually means that I'm jumping ahead to the solution without fully listening to what the problem is. So really, really insightful stuff, and so much tonight that we can take forward, Oscar. Thank you. And obviously we'll keep this open for questions. We'll stick around, but for now, if anyone does need to pop off on the dot of 7:30, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. Sonia, thank you very much for organising this and getting Oscar along. And everybody will be sending out a short survey after this event. We'd love your feedback, and I'm sure it's going to be wonderful because this was just, I enjoyed it so much. I think we all did. So thank you again. Now we'll open up for questions. Would anyone like to jump in?
Feel free to use the chat window for questions if you want to do that as well.
Oscar, while you were talking, I might start. I mean, I was mulling we're sort of in this age of disinformation in the world. When you were talking about COVID, I started thinking about, it's not just COVID, it's been American politics, and it's been, conspiracy theories and this chasm between, the left and right, and the rise of social media and people screaming at each other. And, what impact do you think this lack of listening is having on a global scale?
I was asked a question when I was interviewed 2 Octobers ago, and they told this story about Grumpy Uncle at Thanksgiving. So the host of the radio station said to me, how do you deal with a grumpy uncle who's going to tell exactly the same story and has a firm belief in this story every time? And I think in Australia, that would be the grumpy uncle at the Christmas lunch. And I said to them simply, whatever they start to tell their story about is just ask them a really simple, curious question. When did you first form this belief? Now, what was interesting, 2 months later, I was being interviewed by a host who looked after family businesses, very successful entrepreneurs in multi-generational businesses. The same issue came up. How do you listen to the original founder about they always have an issue about cost control? So back to this grumpy uncle, they asked them the question, and Daniel sent me an email that shocked me. He sent me an email and he said, wow, we asked grumpy uncle the question, when did you first form this belief? And the grumpy uncle said, I first formed this belief when I came back from the Vietnam War and we were completely ignored. And that opened up a whole conversation around the table, and the conversation changed. The grumpy uncle wasn't grumpy anymore. He was a real life human. And I think for a lot of us, one of the practices I do, I deliberately listen to media, podcasts, and TV shows I fiercely disagree with, because listening is the willingness to have your mind changed. Listening is not having your mind changed, but it's the willingness to have your mind changed. So I think for a lot of us, before we put people into boxes of red versus blue, 1 versus 2, whatever box we want to put people in, I think forget about global issues around listening. Listen to people around you that you may have differing views and just ask them that simple question. When did you first form this belief? Because I think in that, all of a sudden, you will discover what their 3 is half of 8 is. So for me, global listening is fixed by all of us listening more effectively to people whose opinions we differ with, that we know, rather than this abstraction of people in the media or people in political parties. It all starts with us.
100%. Has anyone else got anything they would like to jump in with? Questions, comments?
I see some in the chat.
We've got a question. Did you want to tackle that one, Oscar?
Yep.
Have you got any tips?
I'm just going to read it to make sure I've understood it. So you mentioned turning your head to one side represents listening emotionally. Well, it's listening for emotion. And it depends on whether you're right-handed or left-handed, by the way. If you're left-handed, you'll turn your left. If you're right-handed, you'll turn right, because that's where the hemispheres are in your brain. A bit of listening nerdship there for me. So, Christian, are you left-handed? Are you asking that question from that perspective? Please come off.
No, I'm I'll jump in. Sorry, it's a bit of a confusing question. No, so I just heard you mention it before, and then I didn't hear you afterwards. You might have covered it if you turned to the other way, what that meant. So you said, turning one way represents listening for emotion.
Yeah.
I was just curious, if you go the other way, does that represent anything in particular? Is that listening for facts or?
No.
No.
Yeah, it's listening to the right, for the right-handed people, is tuned in for listening for emotion. There's no research or evidence to say that if you listen with your left, you're listening for facts. Probably, if you're looking at people straight in the eye, you're more likely to be listening for facts there. Great question.
Yeah, thank you. I do have one more question, which I didn't type in, which was I haven't sort of fully experienced it yet, but I know I will because I've been warned, and I'm lucky that I have a really good boss who helps me out a bit with this. But something he said I'm going to run into, being a young guy in my field, is I'll be dealing with people who are a lot more experienced than I will, and that's going to be a barrier for them to listen to what I have to say, I guess. So the field of work is going to be sort of around change and instilling change in business. And I think, as I completely understand, if someone, potentially younger or less experienced to you is giving you advice, it can often be met with a bit of, hesitation. So I guess, do you have any tips on how to navigate that, that type of a barrier?
Yeah, I don't think they don't want to listen to you because of your age or your inexperience. I think your opportunity is to listen for their unspoken fears. So it's not that you're younger than them. Their fears might be, I lost 3 of my friends in a brutal restructure 5 years ago, and they promised us it wasn't going to happen. So I'm really not going to listen to you now, because probably the same thing's going to happen. So it's back to listening for the unsaid, being genuinely curious, which I sense you are, around tell me more and what else. Take me back to that last restructure. What can we learn from that so I don't repeat those mistakes? That way you will enroll them and use their own power against them to go, I am inexperienced, you have experienced this, what could you tell me? So I think you're just being open to that, and that will then provide you with permission to use some of your change frameworks as well and integrate it, as opposed to saying we have to create a burning platform and the change needs to be communicated consistently, concisely, clearly, and they're all rolling their eyes, as opposed to, hey, the last time we made a restructure, what do you think I can learn from that? And all of a sudden they get to talk.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I haven't thought of it like that, so that's good. I'm going to take that into my next situation.
Excellent. Well, at least you're conscious of it, because you've got a great boss who's told you about where some of the landmines are.
Yeah, thank you.
By the way, if you're driving change, smokers, bike riders, and personal assistants are the fastest way to spread gossip in an organization.
I might remember that outside for work as well. So thank you.
Okay. Any tips on listening to techniques to lead conversation? Trevor, is that your question or somebody else's?
No, all the good questions and contributions are coming from others.
Okay. I probably need a clarification there.
Sorry, this is the person who requested the question.
Hello.
So
can you say hello? What's your name? I'm Oscar. Nice to meet you.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, my name is Enzo. It's nice to meet you.
G'day.
How you going? So the question, I think, is more around if you're, I guess, you're in an interaction with somebody in a negotiation or in a particular meeting, and you have an intention of where you need that conversation to go. Any listening techniques that will ultimately assist you to achieve that outcome?
Yeah, great question. It makes great sense now. Thanks for adding on to the one you put in the chat box. So too many people orientate their listening on what they're listening for. One of the things we don't spend enough time on is process when it comes to listening. So this is one of those ninja moves when it comes to listening if you're kicking off a negotiation. So I've interviewed mediators, conflict resolution teams, and the big thing most people don't do is spend time focusing on the process. So here's the process question for the counterparty. What would make this a great meeting for you, and how would we get there? Now you're going to have your version of that, because then you say, what would make it a great meeting for me is A, B, and C. From a process perspective, not a content, not an outcome, not what you're negotiating. So it could be as simple as, I'd like to spend half of the meeting getting to understand what you'd like to achieve, and I'd like to spend half the meeting focused on the future. What would you like to do when it comes to the meeting? So more how to listen at the beginning, Enzo, is really critical. Especially for them, because then you can always use that as a North Star or compass setting in the conversation. When they get repetitive, they get emotional, they get distracted, you might say, hey, just a quick reminder, at the beginning of the meeting, one of the things you wanted to do was finish by the halfway point on this. Should we reevaluate the time? So we're not in the content, we're just in the process. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that.
So which bit would you apply from what I've said in what you're going to do now?
Probably the setting the agenda, framing the conversation up front, and just being clear around what we're trying to achieve in the time and in the interaction, so that we've, I guess, got some guardrails in place.
Yeah, fantastic. I interviewed a negotiator who did some negotiation work for UNESCO. And they were working with 36 countries over a period of 5 years on a negotiation. And the thing that they said back to Alan in the debrief was, it didn't matter what day they started, he always started with that question for everybody, and he enrolled everybody in the process of caring, not just about what they wanted to get out of it, but what everyone else is doing as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Enzo. There's a question from Louise. I wonder if you have any tips on how we can help the others to listen to us better, any subtle cues that would encourage us. Louise, are you still on? Yes, you are.
Yep, I'm here.
Is it a boss or a co-worker?
A bit of both. I was probably thinking more kind of speaking up to people who I guess are maybe a bit more resistant to innovation and change and kind of a little bit more set in their ways. But also, I guess, with co-workers as well. We all get a bit overexcited and kind of don't really hear each other.
So there's some parallels from what Christian said earlier on with, you talked about resistance to innovation. I don't think generally we only resist things we don't understand, or we don't understand how it's relevant to us. When it's in a one-on-one or a team meeting context, if you notice people aren't listening, one of the most powerful things you can do is just stop mid-sentence and wait for them to make eye contact with you. And then you can continue talking on the topic. I think one thing people don't do enough of when they're trying to communicate is use pause to create some gravitas for them. And you need to be careful, because some people will just talk over the top of it and you have to jump back in and take control. But a lot of times when people aren't listening, they are distracted with all the things we talked about earlier on. But a pause will carry a huge weight in the room, whether it's a team meeting, a video conference, or anything else. But I'm not quite sure I've answered your question.
No, I think that does help. And I think actually it's probably behavior that I've seen some of those leaders using. But I guess the way it comes across to me is that they're focused on their end goal and what they want to get out of it, and they're not necessarily listening to me. So yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if using similar tactics to them will block the conversation or help it move forward, but yeah, it might be. I think it's an interesting one to try for sure. And
building on Enzo's question from earlier on, you need to, as early as possible in the conversation, signal to the host, what I want to get out of today's conversation is, you need to speak up early. If you're not doing that in the first 5 minutes, you've lost the opportunity to set the context.
Yeah.
Because in doing so an example might be, hey, host, today, I think it's really critical that I get a perspective from everybody on where they stand on this innovation initiative. How much time could we allocate to that today so I can listen to all of you? So again, you move the orientation from you trying to push innovation out to you're listening to them, and all of a sudden they get enrolled. But if you don't do that and you throw a hand grenade in at the 45-minute mark in an hour meeting, they just think of you as destructive rather than constructive. So a lot of us need to set the framing up with how at the beginning of a conversation, whether it's a group conversation or a one-on-one, and the consequences are really significant there as well. The final thing I would say on that is, do you provide feedback to the host to say, hey, you listened really well today, you listened to differing perspectives? Or do you take the time to go to the host and say, hey, there was an opportunity that you didn't hear from all the voices in the room. There were 11 people today, but only 4 people spoke. Next time, host, could we hear from a wider group of people? And I'm sure if it's given in a spirit of progress, it will be received that way, but not enough of us provide debriefing feedback either.
Yeah, thank you. I think that last tip's definitely something I can use. I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. By the way, I used that tip today when I said put in the chat window the one tip you're going to apply, because it teaches me what you actually heard and what you're going to listen, because the difference between hearing and listening is the action you're going to take. Brooke, we need to get a postal address from Eremai or an email address to me. Yes, please. Any other questions that I've missed there?
Nothing you've missed in the chat. Anyone got another question for Oscar? Now's the time to speak up, or for now, hold your peace. I won't say forever. Okay. Well, Oscar, again, thank you so much for joining us. I think I know I speak for everybody when I say we've got so much out of that, so many actionable insights, and we love those. And I very much hope you'll come back and talk to us again one day. And how lucky are we that we can now go away and listen to lots of podcasts on this subject and hear from you and other wonderful people. So thank you again very much, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks everybody so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for listening.